Chapter 3. Buck is sold. While Buck was recovering from his wounds, he saw large furry dogs in cages arrive daily. Others also left daily after visits from rough-spoken men who looked at all of Morgan's dogs, pointed at a few of them, and handed Morgan money. Helpers carried the cages from the room, and Buck never saw the dogs in them again. These acts frightened Buck, and each time he was glad that the strangers did not point at him. But the day came when Buck's strength returned, and he looked once again like the healthy dog that Judge Miller had owned. Morgan was showing a small man around the room. The man spoke English with a French accent, and he moved quickly from cage to cage. He needed only a glance to decide yes or no about a dog. He stopped in front of Curly's cage. Curly was a good-natured Newfoundland who had arrived soon after Buck. She had easily settled down to Morgan's routine of food, no exercise, and no trouble. Now the stranger looked at Curly's teeth and her feet. He felt her legs and chest. Curly bore the examination patiently, her eyes trusting. "She good dog. I take her," said the man. He quickly passed the next 4 cages and stopped in front of Buck's. There he drew in a deep breath as if in surprise. His eyes lit up and he smiled. "Hey, now, Morgan," said the stranger, "here's a wonderful dog. Heavy dog with strong muscles for work. Good furry coat protect him from frost. Where do you find dog like this?" Morgan scowled. "No questions here. If you want the dog, just pay your money." The man knelt down and opened Buck's cage. With a gentle hand, he felt Buck's legs and chest and opened his mouth. Finally, he examined each of Buck's feet. Buck stood quietly, knowing that Morgan and his club were close by. But he trembled because he felt that soon he would be leaving with this stranger. Though he hated Morgan, at least Morgan and the room full of dogs were something that he was used to. Though Buck had not suffered any ill treatment after Morgan's awful beating, he had not received any friendliness either. But now this stranger was running a calloused hand over his head and under his chin. The man's touch and his kind eyes reminded Buck of Judge Miller. "Ah, you know friend, do you not?" said the man, rubbing in back of Buck's ear. To the man's question of how much was wanted for Buck, Morgan answered, 300. The Canadian government can afford that. This is one dog in 1,000. The stranger handed Morgan the money and said, "Not one dog in 1,000. He is one dog in 10,000. Let's go." Buck's cage was latched and Morgan's helpers carried it out to a waiting wagon. Then Curly's cage was lifted on. The 2 dogs exchanged a look that combined fear and excitement. Then their eyes followed the little man as he got into the front seat of the wagon. The 2 dogs never looked back. That part of their lives were over. They were only concerned about the future. Chapter 4. Snow. The man who had bought Buck and Curly was named Perrault. He was a French Canadian and worked for the Canadian government. He and his partner, Francois, carried important official messages by dog sled, and speed of delivery was their main concern. Perrault and Francois sailed from Seattle, Washington, aboard a ship called the Narwhal. Buck stood on deck with Curly and took his last look at warm weather, although he did not know at this time. Perrault took them below deck to meet 2 other large dogs. One was Dave, a gloomy, sleepy dog who only wanted to be left to himself. The other greeted Buck and Curly with a superior air, though he smiled. He was a handsome fellow, snow white and almost as big as Buck. This was Spitz, a dog accustomed to leading and being admired by men and dogs alike. Curly was awed by Spitz. But neither Perrault nor Francois showed much friendliness to the dogs. Even though he had admired and patted Buck earlier, Perrault now maintained a distance. However, he treated all the dogs alike, with fairness. The beautiful Spitz got no larger a dinner than gloomy Dave. But Spitz was not used to being treated the same as lesser dogs, and he decided to assert himself. Smiling, he approached Buck at dinner. When Buck looked up, Spitz snatched his food. Buck sprang to punish him, but at the same moment, Perrault's whip lashed through the air and encircled Spitz. With a howl, Spitz dropped Buck's bone. Buck halted his leap, picked up his bone, and went back to enjoying his dinner. Spitz had been punished by the fair Perrault, and Buck felt that was enough. But he saw Spitz staring at him with anger barely concealed in his snapping black eyes. Though it was only a moment between the stealing of Buck's bone and Buck's taking it back, Curly had started to bark in anxiety and excitement. Dave, however, looked up once and then resumed his own dinner as if nothing were happening. Buck soon saw that nothing could disturb Dave. When the Narwhal started to pitch and roll in a storm, Buck and Curly, never having been on the water before, were half wild with fear. But Dave only gave them an annoyed glance and went to sleep. This helped to shame Buck into calmness, though Curly continued to yelp and race around in fear. The Narwhal plodded on, farther and farther north. When the two men took the dogs for a run on the deck twice a day, Buck felt the change in the weather. It was an icy kind of cold that caused the dog's fur coat to ruffle up. But that way, the fur held in their body heat better. One morning, when Buck woke up, he immediately sensed that something was different. In a moment, he realized that the steady throb of the Narwhal's propeller was silent. The ship was no longer making her way against rough seas. She was in port. Perrault and Francois rushed around packing their belongings. Finally, Francois brought out the dogs' leashes and they lined up eagerly. They were infected by the excitement of the men and the knowledge that the Narwhal had stopped. Buck was the first to follow Francois up onto the deck, but his feet sank down into something white and mushy, something like mud. He jumped back with a snort. Then he noticed that more white stuff was falling through the air and landing on his coat. He shook it off, but more continued to fall. He sniffed at it curiously, then licked some up on his tongue. It bit like fire, and in the next instant it was gone. This puzzled him. He tried it again with the same result. Francois and the deckhands laughed uproariously, pointing at Buck and at the white stuff they called snow. Then, more confident, Buck lifted his huge head and let the snow fall freely onto his face. It made him feel almost playful. Perrault and Francois led Buck and the other dogs down the gangplank of the Narwhal. The snow was falling steadily, but Buck padded along easily, not frightened, not cold. He had begun to master his new surroundings.